Hey everybody, welcome to another study out of the Gospel of Mark. And today we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to read verses 14 through 18, talk a little bit about them, and then we'll continue to move on through the rest of the passage, okay? So if you have your Bible, beginning at verse 14, when they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." Now, I want to tell you that Mark's account of this incident, which is also found in Matthew and Luke, but Mark's account is the most complete, the most detailed of all three. And this also is the last exorcism that Mark will record Jesus doing in his gospel. The scenario occurs when Jesus, Peter, James, and John are coming back from having been on the Mount of Transfiguration. And so they arrive on the scene, they meet up with the disciples that did not go on the mountain, and they find that there's a debate going on between the disciples, the crowd, and the teachers of the law. Now, I've got to tell you, I think it's pretty neat that the disciples felt confident enough, because Jesus is not there, and yet they felt confident enough to engage in argument with the religious leaders of the day. And what they're arguing about, we don't know. But I'm glad that they felt confident to have a discussion. So it says when Jesus came on the scene that the people were amazed. And I wonder about that. Why were they amazed? Could it be that Jesus still had the afterglow from the Mount of Transfiguration? That's probably not what amazed the people, because you remember Jesus told Peter, James, and John, hey, don't say a word about what you've seen, what you've experienced on this mountain. So I don't think it was the afterglow. My feeling is that was just a reaction when people got around Jesus, when they heard him teach, when they saw the miracles that he performed. There was just something about him. Well, he's the Son of God. And people were just thrilled. They were amazed. There was wonderment when they were in the presence of Jesus. So, Jesus asked the disciples, I think he's directing the question to the disciples, what are you guys arguing about? You're arguing with the teachers of the law. What's that all about? But the answer, interestingly, doesn't come from the disciples. It comes from this man who brought his son to be healed. And immediately, this man begins to describe the symptoms that his son is having to deal with whenever the demons are in his life, when they're dealing with his body. And he talks about how he loses speech, and he has seizures, and he begins to foam at the mouth, and his teeth, he begins to grind his teeth, and his body becomes rigid. And you know, today, some people might say, that sounds a lot like epilepsy. Who knows? So, this man brought his son to be healed, and Jesus wasn't there. I think he fully expected Jesus to be present. That was what motivated him to come in the first place. But the disciples are there, minus Peter, James, and John. And you know what? I don't believe they were overwhelmed when this man brought his boy to be healed, because after all, Mark tells us in chapter 3 and verse 15 that part of their commission was to go and deal with the demons, to heal people. They were commissioned by Jesus to do that. And in Mark chapter 6 and verse 13, we're told that they did that with success. So I think when they saw this scenario with this man and his son, they thought, we got this. We can handle this because we've done this before. But that was not the case. They couldn't do it. There was a lot of frustration. So let's read now, beginning at verse 19, and let's read through verse 24. "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." So in verse 19, Jesus responds to this situation, the boy's father and all that's going on. And he says, "You unbelieving generation." Now I want to tell you, I don't think he's talking to the crowds. I don't think he's talking to this father. I think he's talking to the disciples. You unbelieving generation. I think Jesus is severely disappointed in these disciples because in a crucial moment, when they should have had it, they lacked faith. And it led to a situation that was really, really disappointing. So, what had happened? I don't know. It's really interesting because if you read in context, they're coming off kind of a high moment. And when Peter, James, and John leave with Jesus, did they lose their faith? Did they get lax? What happened? We really don't know. But we do know that Jesus is really disappointed. And he says, "How long shall I stay with you?" Key in on that word "stay." Maybe because Jesus had just been on the Mount of Transfiguration. Maybe he longed to go home, to be with his Father. And so he says, "How long am I going to stay with you? I really want to go home," particularly when you're not getting it. You're not really learning what I'm trying to teach you. And then he says, "How long shall I put up with you?" I think Jesus is weary of the spiritual dullness of his disciples. Now, I don't know about you. If you've ever invested yourself in someone, really laid it out for them over a period of time, and it seems like you take 3 steps forward and maybe 2 backward, or maybe 3 backward, or even 4 backward. After a while, you get weary. And I don't know about you. There are times when I just want to give up. What's the use? You're not getting it. You're not going to get it. I'm frustrated with you. And I think Jesus is at this point because if you've been traveling with us in the book of Mark, you know over and over again he's trying to teach the disciples faith lessons. And it seems like they just don't get it. And when they needed it for this situation, it wasn't there. So, Mark then describes this deadly conflict between Jesus and these demonic powers. And as soon as Jesus confronts the demons in this boy, they throw the boy into a convulsion, and they throw him on the ground, and he's rolling around out of control on the ground. He's foaming at the mouth. And then Mark alone, it's not in Matthew, it's not in Luke, records a little interchange, but it's a beautiful little interchange between Jesus and this father. And Jesus simply asked the father, "How long has the boy been like this?" And imagine, there's the boy rolling on the ground. It's a pitiful scene. It's heartbreaking. The father is emotionally undone. And Jesus just says, "How long has he been like this?" And the father says, "Since he was a child." And then the father describes how these demons, this demonic power, has tried to kill him with fire and water over and over again. I know sometimes it's hard, but put yourself in the shoes of that father. This is your child. You've seen this year after year. Can you imagine what that was like? And so the father asked Jesus for help. And I want to say this. When he originally brought his boy to be healed, as I said earlier, I think he fully expected Jesus to be there, but he wasn't. So he came in full faith. Hey, I'm bringing my son. I know Jesus can heal him. But then he meets with this disappointment that the disciples, they can't do it. They can't get it done. And so now, if you notice, he asked Jesus, if you can do anything. Now think about that statement. If you can do anything. And immediately Jesus, he seizes on that idea of if. He wants to address it. If I can do anything. And he says, listen, all things are possible if you have faith. And what's he talking about there? Well, maybe he's talking about the Father, but also maybe he's talking to those disciples. They haven't left. They're still there. They couldn't heal this boy. And he's saying to them, as well as the Father, man, this is all about faith. Everything is possible. You can deal with these situations if you have faith. And I love the Father's response. I mean, this is so powerful. He says, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. It's a mixed belief. I do believe, but there's a part of me that has unbelief. He's so honest with Jesus. John Calvin writes about this statement. He declares that he believes and yet acknowledges himself to have unbelief. These two statements may appear to contradict each other, but there is none of us that does not experience both of them in himself. And you know what? I'm ready to say, I do. That describes me. Belief and unbelief. Now, let's close it out with verses 25 through 29. When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, this kind can come out only by prayer. Did you notice, and you have to pay kind of close attention, it says that there's a crowd running to the scene. And you're thinking, well, wait a minute. Jesus and Peter, James, and John walked into the scene where the crowd was already there. The disciples are there, the crowd's there, and the teachers of the law are there. I think another crowd was coming to the scene. And it's probably because quickly word had spread, Jesus is back. And so another crowd is coming. And this seems to speed up what Jesus wants to do. And so Jesus exorcises this demon. And notice it's accompanied by cries and convulsions. And the effect is so severe on this boy that he seems to the crowd to be dead. Now that's really interesting. It's probably because he's so exhausted that he looks like a corpse. He's just lying there, motionless. Now, it is possible that Mark wanted an illusion, wanted this to appear like a death and resurrection scene. No, the boy had not died. But Mark may want that illusion, that here's somebody that has a demon. And you remember in Mark chapter 5, the end game of demons, the end game of Satan is destruction, is death. And Mark is showing a boy who has demons dead, but what does Jesus do? He reaches down, takes him by the hand, and picks him up, and there is resurrection. That might be an illusion that Mark is trying to create. The idea of dethroning Satan is always a reversal of death and an affirmation of life. So then as the story ends, the 9 disciples who were powerless to act on behalf of this boy privately get Jesus alone, and I would be right there with them. And of course their first question is, why couldn't we do this? Why didn't we have the power? And Jesus responds to their deep concern by saying, this kind, if you look at your scriptures, can come out only by prayer. Now, what does he mean? I'll tell you what I think he means. I think somehow, some way, these disciples had begun to take for granted that they could do this healing, that they could do this exorcism, that they had the power, that somehow it emanated from within them. And what Jesus was saying was, in effect, a gentle rebuke, saying, you guys have stopped praying. Or maybe better said, you've stopped relying on God, who is the giver of the power to do these kinds of things. That's why you lack the faith, because you were trusting in yourself, assuming that you could do it. And the only way you'll ever be able to do these kind of things is by trusting in the power of God through faith, through prayer, through that connection. I think that's what he was saying to the disciples. You know, there's some really good lessons for us. I know there are for me in this text. And again, don't you marvel at Jesus? And don't you see how walking with these disciples, he's constantly teaching them. And it's forward and backward, forward and backward. But I don't know about you, but that reminds me of my walk. And I'm so grateful for the grace and the patience that Jesus shows me and that he keeps teaching me. I've enjoyed our study today. I hope you'll join us again for another study out of the Gospel of Mark. Have a good day.